Baxi's Musical Podcast is brought to you by Canna Provisions. Canna Provisions is an adult-use cannabis dispensary with the largest selection of cannabis products in Western Massachusetts, with locations both in Holyoke and in Lee. They're not just a dispensary, they are a destination. Visit cannaprovisions.com. That's cannaprovisions.com. Adults 21, please, and please consume responsibly. And now, my interview with Dave Gregory from XTC on Baxi's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxi's Musical Podcast.
I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I've made no secret of the fact that my favorite all-time band is the band XTC. Obsessively so. And while the temptation to only talk about XTC during this podcast is pretty damn strong, I have chosen to spare you all of that. There are, after all, other bands out in the world that I love just as well, but probably not as much. Could I do a different XTC podcast every week? Sure. Will I? Probably not, because there's already a podcast for that, and it's a pretty damn good one. However, when the opportunities have presented themselves, I simply cannot say no. So when I had the chance to talk to Andy Partridge or Colin Moulding of XTC, what was I supposed to do? When I had the chance to speak to producer Hugh Padgham about producing XTC's 1982 double album English Settlement, or engineering 1980's Black Sea, or 1979's Drums and Wires, I had to be sure to ask him about other things as well, like The Police, or Peter Gabriel, and Phil Collins. And when I had the chance to talk to Thomas Walsh of Pugwash about writing music with Andy Partridge, the two of us spent nearly 25 minutes talking about XTC before we ever got around to talking about his own music. And we never got the chance to talk about the music he recorded with today's guest, XTC's guitar wizard, Dave Gregory. From 1979 to 1999, Dave Gregory was, and this is a very powerful statement, the instrumental muscle of XTC. Dave Gregory is the multi-instrumentalist that took on the task of replacing keyboard player Barry Andrews just before the band's commercial breakthrough with Making Plans for Nigel from Drums and Wires. From there, XTC would embark on a punishing schedule on the road until 1982, when Andy Partridge abruptly retired from live performances. For the next 17 years, XTC would relegate themselves exclusively to the studio, where they produced an incredible string of albums, including their masterpiece Skylarking, which they released in 1986. Dave Gregory was an essential centerpiece in actualizing the genius of the band's two primary songwriters in Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding. And with his incredible skill as an instrumentalist and arranger, it's hard to imagine what the band might have sounded like without him. And so it was my pleasure to finally get a chance to speak with Dave Gregory from XTC on Baxi's Musical Podcast. Good to see you.
Yes, likewise.
Yeah.
How are you?
Wonderful, thank you. Wonderful. I want to start off, first of all, tell you about a year and a half ago, I interviewed Andy. Last summer, I interviewed Colin. I also interviewed Hugh Padgham, and even spoke to Thomas Walsh of Pugwash, who says hello, by the way.
Okay.
And all of it in preparation to finally get a chance to speak to Dave Gregory. So I think I'm finally ready to finally talk to the muscle behind XTC. So welcome.
I like it. I like your style already.
Well, XTC has always been, I think, from the very moment I heard them, a band that immediately connected with me. And we're going back to Black Sea was really the first album that I heard and just fell in love with it. And even to this day, I think what's really unusual about this band is even to this day, there are still things within those songs that I'm hearing for the very first time. And I don't know if it's the complexity of the songwriting, but I think as it relates to you, when I hear your guitar work and your arrangements and how together you and Andy were able to play off each other, you don't hear that with any band, at least to not that level. Tell me a little bit about, working with him just on a purely musical level.
it was kind of a learning process for me in a way, because I'd come from being kind of lead guitarist, quote unquote, in most of the bands that I've been with. The band I was in immediately prior to joining XTC was a guitar-led band, and I was the sort of basic, it was just, guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. And that was kind of, I'd always seen myself as I say, quote unquote lead guitar. And so when I actually went to audition with Andy and the band, I suddenly had to think, well, now, hang on a minute. I'm just Johnny come lately here. I've got to just step back and be led, really,
Right.
be led into how to think about this new concept of having a principal songwriter and someone who also plays great guitar, or who actually plays a very individual, fantastic guitar style that I somehow have to be complementary with /2.
Right.
So there you go. I had to rethink my whole approach to guitar. It was always, we always had this idea that we wouldn't fall into the usual rock cliches. I mean, this is the thing about Andy. If he thought that anything that he came up with had been done before, he'd kick it into the long grass and we'd move on. There was just no way he was going to go the rock and roll route or the blues route, all the sort of guitar-based band cliche stuff. That was never going to be happening with us. Because really, he was a songwriter. He was using his guitar as a tool to help him write songs and to create music, obviously. And so I had to fit in with that. And in fact, it wasn't that difficult because the songs were so great. You'd have to be a bit mess them up, frankly. And Colin Moulding, he had his bass playing I don't think has ever really been properly recognized as part of the musical framework of XTC. It was hugely important. He had a very individual style, lots of melody, lots of alternative kind of playing that most bass wouldn't occur to most people playing bass. So we all approached it with an idea of forming something. We didn't overthink it. That was the other thing. It wasn't like we sat for weeks in rehearsal deciding what was going to work and what wasn't. It was all kind of, as soon as it sounded good, we'll leave it that way, and then when we get to the studio, if we think of anything else, it's better.
When you joined the band, and obviously Barry Andrews a pretty charismatic guy, and people looked at him as being as strong an individual in that band as maybe anybody else, maybe even as almost as strong as Andy. And you step in there. Obviously, Andy had a reputation as a songwriter, but what would happen in the next couple of years, Drums and Wires, Black Sea, English Settlement, is you're starting to see the development of somebody in a pretty rapid period of time. Did you understand the level of which he was operating on, or had the capabilities of operating on, just as a songwriter?
Not when I first joined, no. He was always very, very gifted. And I always had respect for him, not just as a songwriter, but as an artist. I've seen his drawings and paintings that he did as a kind of hobby, and they're professional standard, really high level sort of graphic art stuff, and with the humor as well. And some of it, I can tell you, was pretty cruel. When he started doing caricatures of the band, they were merciless, but funny. You couldn't be mad at him because they were just too good. So I always knew of his ability as an artist, and that was reflected as well in his songwriting and his music. But the way he developed as a songwriter, you have to remember, they kicked off their career with this daft song called Science Friction, which they'd been playing in around Swindon for the previous 3 or 4 years. I think it predates the Helium Kids. It goes way, way back. And then finally that comes out on this EP as their first release, having signed to Virgin in 1977. And it was just like, well, we've been hearing all these songs for the last 3 or 4 years around town. Finally, they've got them on record. Isn't it great? But I never imagined that I could never predict how far he was going to go with that thread of originality, because that's really you can't really pin down what his influences are as a writer, other than sense of melody. Both him and Colin both had really great ears for melody, and that comes from their love of the Beatles and the Kinks, particularly, and all the Britpop bands from the '60s, really, that we went to school listening to. But like I said, when you consider that the guy who wrote Chalk Hills and Children is the same man that wrote science fiction 10 years earlier, that's quite a giant leap, really.
I agree. I saw the documentary that came out a couple years ago. This is Pop, and it was released here in the States for a period of time, and then unfortunately, it's almost impossible to find now. But it's a really good documentary in the sense that there are very few bands with that kind of story. You have a guy who is a pretty dominant member of the band. The first hit comes from the guy who is quieter but equally as talented, and then all of a sudden, there are major changes going on, things that would normally break up most bands. I mean, the idea that jealousies could have played a part in Colin being singled out as writing the singles, but that Andy would write everything else. That alone would have caused tremendous friction in any other band, but yet for whatever reason, XTC continued to endure that, which I think it says a lot to the fact that you guys were all real dedicated to XTC, and whether or not feelings were hurt, there was like a bigger picture in mind, or at least there seemed to be. Is that your impression of it too?
Yeah, pretty much. That's it. We were friends, and that was our life for a good, 15 years. It took precedence over everything, including family in some cases. So, it was like every time that was all we thought about. At least I can only speak for myself, but I'm pretty sure the other guys were writing every hour they had in their spare time. I often wonder how they were able to come up with so much stuff, even though we'd been off the road after '82. Actually, yes, in fact, it's 40 years ago this month, April, that XTC's flight from LA signaled the very end of the touring unit.
Yeah.
And Terry Chambers' departure. But they just kept coming up with the songs. That's what kept us together. It was a shared sense of friendship and a sort of local brotherhood, because we were just from this little town in the West Country. Like you say, no other band had that kind of structure. It was the weirdest thing, but I can only put it down to the fact that there was always music to work on. There was never any shortage of material. There was a lot of friction. There were a lot of arguments and nastiness occasionally, but you kind of, it's just life, isn't it? You get over it and move on. And what's the next song going to be? What's the next album going to sound like? Who's going to produce it? Who's going to drum on it?
Right.
All of this needed thinking about, and it occupied most of our time.
People have made a very big deal about you guys coming off the road, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But the reality is, and I never had the chance to see XTC live, but I know that what you guys did during the time that you were on the road is you guys had a punishing road schedule. It wasn't like it was a rarity to see XTC, whether you were, playing with the guys from Talking Heads or the Police. You were on the road all the time, and the demands of that had to be pretty profound, especially for a guy like, for Andy, who was struggling with addiction issues, but for the rest of you, that had to be exhausting.
It was exhausting, and also added to the fact that the first American tour that we did in the early months of 1980, that was all done pretty much in a Dodge minibus overland. We had, motels to sleep in. Well, that was one thing. We did have a bed for the night, but, we were literally on the road, and we covered, not just for the band, but the crew as well. They really did put in the hours, as they say. But we were young and stupid, and we wanted to do it. We were ambitious. We wanted people to know about us. And it was the opportunity to actually tour America. It was great for me because I'd always wanted to go to the States, and just as a tourist, really. And I would never miss an opportunity whenever we got to a new town. I'd get up, have breakfast, and go out with a camera and take some pictures, because I thought, well, I'm never coming back here. Got to make the most of this. it was the best way to. It's the way I was seeing it at the time.
Yeah.
What a great way to spend a holiday.
I've always, read interviews with Andy saying that, he didn't, for whatever reason, he didn't think XTC was much of a live band. But the proof is in the pudding, and there's plenty of footage of you guys playing live. And I mean, quite honestly, that was a very, very tight band. It's very hard to be critical of your performances.
Well, it was kind of it was out of kilter with everything else that was going on at the time. There was nothing mainstream about it. It was the butt end of punk slash new wave. So
Right.
we were kind of. I'm talking about when we came to the States more than maybe less so. It was more noticeable in the States than it was in Europe or in the UK when we were touring, because everyone had been sort of gotten used to punk and bands sounding very, very edgy and a bit slapdash and a little bit noisy and not very refined. Whereas in America, that was still, something that they were getting used to. And I think we probably owe it to bands like, the Police springs to mind, who are, three really excellent musicians who kind of surfed in on the punk slash new wave thing and did something more progressive with it and did it in a very professional way. And I think they kind of allowed American audiences to have a more sympathetic ear to some of the other new wave acts that were coming out of Britain, certainly. And we were sort of, I've listened to some rough cassettes and tapes that were made on the road around that time, the early 1980s, and it does sound very kind of, dissonant, shall we say. But what was there was this drive and energy, and I've listened to these tapes and thought, where did all this power come from? I don't remember. I could not play as hard and fast today as I did back then. But like I said before, we were young and stupid and determined.
You mean you couldn't pick up a guitar and play Scissor Man as fast as you used to play back in your 20s?
No, I can't play Scissor Man.
Really?
I can remember recording it at, just to digress slightly. I was with this guy, with this band called Tin Spirits some years ago. They were big XTC fans. So we were going to do this, but if we put this band together, we must do some XTC material. And Dan Steinhardt, who was the guitar player of the band, said to me, okay, we've got to do Scissor Man. I said, no problem, Scissor Man, yeah, I can do that with one hand tied behind my back. I went to sleep playing Scissor Man back in the day. Well, so I got a Scissor Man, now that's it. But there was a technique to it. There's a lot of sort of upstrokes and everything with the right hand, and I couldn't play it up to speed. I tell you now, I could not play it up to speed. And yet I remember when we recorded it, Steve Lillywhite had us pretty much double track all the guitar parts, and that was one of them. And I'm listening to it and I'm thinking, yeah, that's a seamless double track. You'd hardly know there were two guitars playing. So that was how effortless it was in my 20s. Now I'm nudging 70. No, I'm going to need some notice on that.
I think it's true with a lot of people. You forget the athleticism that's involved in playing a musical instrument, whether it's drums or keyboards and especially guitars. Like, you're perfectly capable of playing all of those notes in order without messing it up. But the speed of which you're required to play is incredible.
That's right. No, that was part of the whole punk thing. It was more energy. Yeah, it was more perspiration than inspiration, shall we say?
Yeah.
And that was a big part of it. The actual onstage energy, we never forgot that. And it just came naturally.
You mentioned the Police and their musicianship. My understanding, and this is after talking to Hugh Padgham, who certainly worked with them, and other people that I've talked to, it's like, I think they drew as much from you guys as you may have from them, and that there was some sophistication that was coming off XTC, which I think inspired them in a lot of ways. Never mind just the fact that Padgham had engineered and produced some of your records. I think they were learning things very specifically about how you guys approached your songs, and I think they applied the same thing to theirs, especially later on in their career.
Well, I don't. You'd have to ask Sting or Stuart or even Andy Summers about that. I don't know. I couldn't possibly say, but they did. They were kind enough to allow us to share their bus. We did a tour. We did some tour dates with them at the end of 1980 at some American big arena shows, which was great for us because it exposed us to a lot of people. We opened up for them, and we travelled with them on their bus, so they must have liked us for a short while anyway. And it was we got along fine. As far as
Yeah.
I remember, there was no antipathy or any kind of.
Well, I got to tell you, I've never heard anyone say a bad word about Dave Gregory. I've heard people say, a couple of things about Andy, maybe Colin on occasion, but not very often. But nobody says anything bad about Dave Gregory. I don't know if
Oh,
they're.
they don't know me too well, do they?
I,
You
I'm
got to.
I'm wondering if they're afraid of you.
Yeah, no, it's nice to have friends. That's all I'm going to say on that one.
I do want to talk about the decision to come off the road because to me it's a fascinating and very sad story as well. My understanding from talking to Andy is that this is a situation that had been going on for a while. He had been addicted to Valium, which he had been taking since the age of 12, and suddenly he stops. And in many cases, if you took somebody off of Valium, the withdrawal from that would kill him. And here's Andy going through a really significant situation, and you guys are just looking to continue as a band, play on the road. It had to be incredibly frightening to be a part of that. Did you suspect that Andy was having a problem prior to him quitting, or were you blindsided by that whole thing?
Well, I didn't understand the nature of his addiction to Valium. I knew he was taking some kind of some medication of some sort, but I didn't really question it that deeply, to be perfectly honest with you. I should have done, possibly. Maybe we all should have done, realized. But like I say, we didn't. We couldn't think further than when the next gig was, or when the next album session was going to start, or what the new songs were going to sound like. I mean, it was just we just took it for granted that Andy was always going to be delivering. We knew he wasn't happy on the road. And I knew also, because I kind of roomed with him for a while, and occasionally he'd have these panic attacks in the middle of the night, which I knew wasn't normal. But it was, but then again, Andy isn't, the guy you meet every day. He's sort of, I always knew he was a little bit odd. But I had no idea that, what was causing this. And maybe that's what the medication was for, is to help to stop his panic attacks. So I knew that there was something amiss, but I didn't realize how serious it was.
By the time he decides that he can no longer do this, he can no longer perform or tour, as a guy that's working that close to him, what was going on in your head as far as the future of your career that had to be remarkably frightening? On one hand, here's your partner and your friends struggling with something really significant, but on the other hand, we're talking about your livelihood as well. That's a pretty heavy burden to shoulder for a young guy.
Well, we didn't really have what you'd call a successful career. Nobody was getting properly paid. We were getting wages. And we'd been on the road for, it's another reason Andy wanted to come off the road. He wasn't seeing any financial reward. None of us were. The most money I think that he was being paid at the time came from broadcast royalties, not even publishing money, or certainly not record royalties. We were in debt to the company to hundreds of thousands. And there were we never got to see any accounts. And we were doing all this road work and everything, and it's the old story, It's just what happens to every single band. Most bands find out about it and do something about it. We didn't. We just kept going as though nothing was happening. And so when Andy finally gave up and said, "Look, I can't do this anymore," then we actually had a chance to take a look at exactly what had been going on with the money. But the thing was, you see, to me, I felt at the time I was just fortunate to be there. I was doing what I'd always dreamt of doing. How long I was going to continue to be able to do that and get away with it was neither here nor there, really. If it ended in 1982 for all of us, I'd have said, well, okay, we did that. It might be something to tell our kids about in the future. But there it is. We've done that work. It's done. And we can go down the pub and entertain folks with it, and that's it.
Right.
I never really had. None of us had what you'd call a career plan, so it didn't really. We had enough money to live on, but it was kind of, the day job was never that far away. It was always a likelihood that we were going to have to go back and do that at some point. Fortunately, Andy, for all his problems, never lost the need to continue to create music and write songs. And I remember him saying at the time, look, I'm really sorry this has had to happen. I can't do the touring thing anymore, but I don't want us to break up. I'll keep writing songs if you're happy to just make records. If we can carry on making records, let's see how long we can do that. And that's the reason I'm talking to you today, and I'm still, thank goodness, reasonably solvent.
Those next two records, Mummer and Big Express. I mean, there are moments on those records that are just wonderful and hold up to anything else in the XTC catalog. But they get maligned in a little bit of ways, especially Big Express, which I'm not sure I really buy, because there are, like I said, there are moments on both of those records you say, well, this is just amazing stuff. Love on a Farm Boy's Wages would be a perfect example. That is a beautiful song with incredible guitar work for an acoustic song. And I think of other songs on Big Express too. It's fascinating to me that the thing that winds up changing your fortunes is the Dukes of Stratosphere after that, because it's, on one hand, it's a lark, but on the other hand, on the other side of the equation is this brilliant record, the 25 o'clock. Every part of it is just so well done and so precise and so earnest. I thought it was the most incredible thing I had ever heard any band attempt to do, and I still hold to that.
Well, that's brilliant, because we love doing that, and I think the fact that neither Mummer nor the Big Express sold in sufficient quantities to change our lives, and certainly didn't go down that well with the record company. We found ourselves, I'm sure you've heard the story anyway, we found ourselves with a bit of time before Christmas of '84. We had John Leckie on standby, who was going to work with Andy on this other project that had been cancelled. So we had they both had spare time. And Andy had been talking about doing this psychedelic send-up EP for years and years, even before I joined the band. He pitched the idea to me. So he said, look, I've got, John thinks he can find a studio for a couple of weeks. That's enough time to do an EP. Do you fancy doing it? So we just said, well, all right, yeah, why not? We're not doing anything else. We can't promote the Big Express. We can't, there's nothing else going on until the next recording budget comes in. Let's go and do it. So yeah, that was, and it was a case of just finding all the stuff that we loved listening to as kids, going to school, and being there when the first blossoming of that whole psychedelic period of British pop happened in 67, 68, where people were using sitars and mellotrons and experimenting with Indian instruments and all the silly stuff, and the Pink Floyd studio tricks and all that kind of all of the Sid Barrett, the Barrett era of Pink Floyd was really, that was one of the touchstones. But yeah, no, it was just a real lark, a good fun.
Yeah,
and I was amazed at how well it turned out.
it sounded like it was and I may be wrong about this. It sounded like that was the Dukes of Stratosphere was the first time you guys were having fun again. Like, not to say that the other record, the previous two records were not fun or they had their moments, but it sounded like you were taking it very seriously back then. Like there was a lot on the line. But here you just, it all stripped it down and said, to hell with it. Let's just have a good time. And that's what it sounded like.
that's exactly how it went. And we it's the most fun I'd had in the studio since Drums and Wires, because that was great for me. It was a complete novelty making that record.
Yeah.
We were just feeling our way as players together and just finding out what we sounded like as a new band. And now here was this other band that we were experimenting with, trying to become, and it was just there was just no pressure, like you say. There was a lot of pressure on us, as I say, with two. I won't say failed albums behind us, but albums that were not seen, that hadn't done our career any favors, really. We were kind of treading water.
Right.
Plus, of course, we'd lost Terry Chambers, who was a big part of the original band, a huge part of it. So we were having to, acclimatize ourselves with, there was nothing wrong with the way, we loved Pete Fitz drumming. I thought he was a great drummer, and he fitted in. He was a really nice guy. He was keen. He was up for the gig, and he played really well, and we all got along. And but again, the thing is, I think perhaps knowing that we didn't have to go out and reproduce the songs live meant that we got maybe a little bit lazy and overindulgent, possibly. I don't know what it was, because I don't think there was that much wrong with the songs themselves.
No, I don't think so either. And I think, I mean, you can make the argument that the Dukes of Stratosphere were probably more overindulgent, because you were taking, I mean, you were throwing everything into these songs, every possible trick that you could possibly try to recreate that psychedelic sound was used in this EP. It was, to me, if you want to talk about indulgent, thank goodness it was, because it came up with a brilliant effort by you guys.
Well, the difference between the Big Express and the Dukes was the fact that we had a little rule. We said, look, how they would worked in 1966 through to 68 would have been, the record company would have allowed them 3 hours to do everything. So it's going to have to be first takes for everything. No, we can't. No overdubs. No, there were lots of overdubs, obviously, but first take, whatever floats through your transom while the basic track is playing, and that's what's going on take. Amazingly, that's pretty much how it went down. There were a couple of places where we used some tricks. I'm thinking now of the piano break in Your Gold Dress, where there's this little sort of Nicky Hopkins style arpeggiating little piece in the middle section of that song, which, if you play along with the record, you'll notice it's in C sharp major, and that's like 7 sharps, horrible key. So I said to John, can we slow this down a semitone? I can play it in C major, much simpler, and then when you speed it up, hopefully it'll be in pitch. So the song slowed down a little. I could play it in a simple key, speed it back up. Suddenly I'm a genius. So that was a little bit of trickery that really, really paid off, because it gave the piano that daft, the Rolling Stones, She's a Rainbow kind of effect.
Do you think that skylarking could have happened had it not been for the Dukes of Stratosphere? Just the idea on the songs themselves, because I mean, I've heard it said before, and I kind of agree with it, that there's a lot of parallels between that project and skylarking, and it just seemed like there's a lot of connectivity between both of those.
Yeah, I think the skylarking is the Dukes, abroad, grown up, and working with Todd Rundgren, who was another. I mean, he fits the Dukes of Stratosphere. The guitar player from the Nas, yes, please, we'll have him. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. And I'd actually sent Todd. We met Todd Rundgren one on tour in '81. He showed up quite by chance in our dressing room at the Park West in Chicago, having played a gig with Utopia in Chicago that same night, and he raced over to our gig to catch the last 10 minutes of it. And there he is, suddenly he's in the dressing room. I said, what are you doing here? I was, his biggest fan. Suddenly here he is. And so that was our first introduction. So after we'd done 25 o'clock, I thought, well, Todd might enjoy this. I'm going to send a copy of this to his management and hopefully they'll pass it on, because they'd already done this album, Deface the Music,
Hmm.
which was a send-up of a lot of Beatles songs done in the Beatles style, very cleverly kind of disguised, which I'd really enjoyed. So I sent him a copy. I heard nothing at all, until the list of producers was announced by Virgin Records. People who we were told by our A&R department at Virgin that we needed to find an American producer for the next record, because we weren't selling any records in the States, and that's what we needed to do if we were going to continue. So when Todd Rundgren's name came up, that was it. Game over. I'm sorry, you can send the other guys home.
Yeah.
We've got to do this with Todd. This is our one big opportunity.
There's been a lot written and a lot said by all of you, Andy in particular, about, what went on in the studio. And obviously this is like a situation where you have two alpha males and, two attack dogs going after each other at the same time. And it just seemed like it was destined to be difficult, but yet the result of it is just a remarkable record in Skylark. I told Andy the story when I spoke to him, that when my kids were really young, and like real young, and they would cry and they were upset or whatever, I would pick them up out of their crib, and I would sing to them two songs. One was Beatles, Here, There, and Everywhere, and another one was like a lullified version of Earn Enough for Us, which you would not think would be a great lullaby, but it's how I felt it. And it always, I told Andy, his music always put my kids to sleep. So, but
that's a great story.
Yeah. And
because I can hear the melody of it. It's quite sort of, yes, that could be transferred to a lullaby. I think you could probably use that in a different setting, and it would work really well. Did it do the trick? Did the kids go to sleep?
Yeah, I don't think it would work on them now. They're all in their 20s, but back then, it certainly did do the trick. And it's always been one of my favorite XTC tracks. But the reality is that it had to be very, very difficult. You're excited about working with Todd Rundgren. You got a great bunch of songs here, and yet there's just this overwhelming tension between Andy and Todd that to this day has never been resolved and probably will never be.
No, much has been made about this conflict. It wasn't always like that. There were just a few really, like you say, heads butting, antlers being, heads. That kind of thing goes on. But of course, it got very, because like you say, they're both very headstrong people, the immovable object meeting the irresistible force and all that. But most of the time they got along. It wasn't like they were at each other's throats the whole time. What was really bad, and I blame Andy for it principally, was bleating to the press about it afterwards. He should never have done that. If they had personal issues with the producer or with anybody, you don't go to the press and then start moaning about it. It's just wrong. But then again, he's always been a blabbermouth, and you can't shut him up. If he's got a bee in his bonnet, everybody has to know about it. So, I'm pointing the finger at him for that bad feeling, because it just, when it finds its way into print, or on video or anything, it assumes a much bigger importance than it actually was.
Yeah.
We got a great record out of it, and we worked with a legendary guy who saved our career. He deserves all the credit for saving our career in America, because, dear God, wasn't, and he didn't even want it on the album, and I'm not sure that he would have. Had anyone else suggested we get a child to sing the opening verse, he would have, told us what to do with that idea. But Todd pushed it through, and that's what kind of broke us in the States.
The documentary we talked about, This Is Pop, shows Andy trying to describe his process of writing songs, the synesthesia, where he's able to connect one sense to inform another. So he sees music and associates it with a color or a number or whatever it may be, some visual. that comes to it. And he showed it on the documentary, and he kind of did it when I talked to him. You know, a lot gets made about that kind of thing. You know, Brian Wilson has that. There are other writers that have it, and you hear the word tossed around, and I don't know how you feel about this, but you hear the word genius being used in association with Andy. Do you see it that way? And do you see him as a genius as a result of what he has been able to come up with?
I think genius is one of these overused words. Genius is something I always grew up thinking that was reserved for people who had some kind of, extra sensory gifts that were extraordinary and unique to them. And certainly Andy has a talent that is pretty unique. I wouldn't necessarily describe him as a genius. Maybe because I'm too close to him. I know him too well. That's probably what it is. There aren't many musicians I would describe as the genius musicians. I would say you could count on the fingers of one hand, of having the ability to produce magic at will, regardless of any kind of formal tuition or instruction. Stevie Wonder springs to mind.
Right.
How that man has achieved what he's done without eyesight, just from pure instinct and intuition and energy and all the rest of it. There's very, very few people that I would, in musical terms, and I don't know enough about science or scientists to tell you who the real geniuses might be.
A few years after Skylarking and after Oranges and Lemons, and you mentioned Chalk Hills and Children's, None Such comes up, and there's a couple of songs on there where you say, man, if it isn't genius, he's damn well close to it. It's loaded with songs, from both of them, both him and Colin, and your playing and arrangements are just perfect. But after that, things with Virgin come to a head, and I believe it was your suggestion that maybe what needs to happen to get yourself out of this debt and this difficult situation is to go on strike. And for the next couple of years, there was no XTC music and there was no movement. Tell me about because one of the things in the documentary that was never addressed that I really wanted to know is, once you guys decided to go on strike against Virgin, what did you do between the moment you made the decision to the moment that you finally were able to get out of that contractual obligation with them?
Yeah, what was going on? That's a good question. Well, we indulged. We got involved with a variety of other projects. I can't recall exactly what Andy was. He was producing bands. He wasn't doing any performing as such. He was writing songs for other artists. Let me see. In 1992 through to 97. Well, let me see. I did a tour with Amy Mann. I toured with some other musicians as well. I did session work. I did a couple of albums in Italy with an artist called Alice. I was doing a bunch of sessions actually, but it wasn't like a full time. I think I was just sort of bumming around Swindon, thinking about doing my own record and not getting very far with it, or making a start and just abandoning it because it was rubbish. And that's still going on to this day, but that's another story altogether. But no, that's a good question. I mean, the time kind of just went by very, very quickly. And Andy and Colin carried on writing, perhaps not as intently as they had done previously, but they were still writing songs. And I think the demos started to appear sometime around 95, 96. And I'd begun, sort of doing prep work on a lot of the songs. And they just kept piling up. I think I ended up with more than 30 songs in demo form that I was listening to and trying to think up parts for. Difference was Andy in that time built a studio in his garden, the garden shed, and it was equipped with multi-track recorder, the original ADAT machine, the Alesis ADAT 8-track digital recorder. and his demos were becoming, almost like professional finished masters. Not to Andy's satisfaction, of course. I would have listened to him and thought, well, you could put that out tomorrow. That's just great, because he'd already done an album with Martin Newell. I think that was the first thing that he'd done, The Greatest Living Englishman,
yeah.
which is Martin's. Yeah, that was all done. It was the first project he'd done in the shed. That would have been 93 into 94. And so it was all starting, everyone was starting to work alone in their own musical dens. So when these demos finally appeared, they were pretty much fully fledged and fleshed out, and there wasn't that much for me to do, as it turned out. But I was still finding corners. You probably noticed the Apple Venus record.
Yeah,
sounds less like a band and more like a solo project. And so that was kind of. But to go back to your question about Virgin, the company had changed. The departments, all the people that we knew there had moved on to other companies, done different things. We didn't know the new people. All we had was this outstanding royalty audit claim that they refused to settle. We got some money, but they didn't. They didn't. And it costs a lot of time and money getting these things dealt with. So their attitude was, well, look, if you want this money, you'll have to take us to court, which we didn't feel like paying any more lawyers to do. And because there wasn't that much, it was just the principle of it, and I just thought, I shouldn't probably be speaking, but it's a long time ago. It's water under the bridge now. You live and learn. We've done similar audits since, and they've paid up, and they've been okay about it. That's Universal Music now. They're in charge of everything, and so for me, having quit the band in '98, I had them, agree to pay me my share of the Virgin catalogue. Then basically all the stuff that we'd done on Virgin that was that had now recouped. And they were getting, royalty every 6 months.
Yeah.
Not a huge one. It was enough money to live on. So that's how the situation is today. Fast forwarding.
Because I've always wondered how you guys found a way to fare through all that. It's a pretty bold decision to have made, but I'm glad that in hindsight things are okay, and you've been able to make a living out of that, because I'd be scared to death to do that.
You have to remember, Andy and Colin, of course, being songwriters, they got publishing royalty. And that was a huge amount of money compared with what you got from record sales. Because, of course, there's all kinds of associated costs with record sales. By the time you get your three halfpence, everybody else has been paid. Whereas publishing money, that goes directly to the writer, as does PRS, the PRS payments for public performance. Now, as sidemen, we get a share of what from this company called PPL. We get paid a royalty every, it's 40, I think we get paid. We get a little bit of money for broadcast royalties, which helps a lot. But I didn't have a family to feed, you see, so it was easy for me. It was just me. I didn't have a wife and kids to look after, and I was also living rent-free because, I'd lived in a tiny 2-up, 2-down house in the town centre in Swindon for 15 years. It cost me, I'd got the mortgage paid off just before this awful nation began.
All three of you still live in Swindon. Swindon is a good-sized town, but it's not so big that you don't occasionally must find yourself in the same room together. I don't know if you ever bump into Andy or Colin, or does that simply not happen?
No, I haven't seen Andy face to face for about, must be 12, 13 years now.
Really?
They occasionally exchange emails, and they're reasonably civilized and friendly. Colin, I don't even know where Colin lives. I know he lives somewhere on the other side of Swindon, in the village, but I don't know where he lives. No idea.
I know you must get hammered all the time about the idea of getting the band back together. And when I talked to Colin, I think he said it probably more concisely than anyone, and basically said, when you've spent your entire life doing as much as you can on one project, at some point you just say, there's no appeal in doing it anymore. I've done all I can do. And I
Yeah.
think with the kind of, personalities that the three of you, have, it would have to be just purely about music, and everything would have to be cast aside. But I don't think Colin's got I think he feels like he's getting too old for this. And, you hear all the time about Andy still working. And I think, even you're kind of in a semi-retirement situation. In your view, I mean, what would it really take to do it? I mean,
But to get to do XTC again,
yeah,
I can't imagine it ever happening because, well, as you probably know, Terry Chambers is now out on the road with the XTC. He's got found three guys who are happy to play XTC songs. They've just done a very successful tour of American clubs.
yeah,
They've just got back last week. It all went very well. And I remember Terry invited me to come down for a jam. This was about 18 months ago, when he was thinking of putting this band together. And Steve Tilling was there, and a couple of other guys who are no longer with them. And they just said, well, just for old time's sake, come down and have a play, So I went down, took a guitar down to their rehearsal room, and we ran through a bunch of old songs. For the first time I played with Terry since he quit,
yeah.
And it was okay. But to be perfectly honest with you, they said, well, do you think it's worth going out and doing this a second time, and and having another bash? And I said, no, I just haven't got the love for it now. I'm sorry. This has been fun, for old time's sake.
Because he wanted you to do Scissor Man, right?
Well, that's right. Actually, that was one I think I managed to talk my way out of doing it. But there was most of the stuff from a lot of Drums and Wires and Black Sea stuff, and Settlement as well, which were all, most of them I could just about struggle through.
Yeah.
And I knew that I could play them if I'd allowed myself enough time to practice and be prepared. It's whether I wanted to do it, and frankly, I didn't.
Well, Dave, I got to tell you, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And again, it's one of those things where I'm glad I got Andy and Colin out first, because really this is the interview I wanted to do. But no, it's a real joy to talk to you, and I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Good to talk to you.
All the best.
You too. Look, I'm not going to make any promises, but one of these days I may get around to talking about XTC again. I thought you should know. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to share it, subscribe it, like it, review it. Tell all your friends about it. You can email me at backs@rock102.com. I'd love to know what you think. Thanks again to Canna Provisions for their support, and you can support them by going to cannaprovisions.com. We'll see you next time on Backsea's Musical Podcast.